Net Zero, Changing the Culture in Boards. We now shift to boardrooms and leadership culture and how they must evolve to meet net zero ambitions. And please welcome already on the stage Tanya Mihailovska-Dimitrievska, Audit Director at Global Bank UK and Lead Ambassador of Women on Boards Adria, and Wieke Skolton, Founder of BR Insights and Specialist in Behavior, Risk and Leadership, but also Managing Partner at BR Insights, right? Okay, I forgot that. Thank you. Together they will present on changing the culture in boards for a net zero future.
Thank you, Ognan.
Thank you.
So welcome everyone on our fire chat today with Vika, where we are going to discuss about strengthening ESG responsibilities through board practices. This is quite a new topic, maybe in the Adria region, but it is quite a hot topic in UK, in US, in APAC, and because of that we thought that it will be quite interesting to have specialists from that area with us here where we can discuss and have focus on this. So my name first is, as Ognan mentioned, Tanya Dimitrievska, and I work in one global bank as audit director. I'm governance expert. And I used to work together with Vika in my previous job on behavioral risk reviews and also board effectiveness reviews. And I just want to say that during my regular work, I collaborate also with boards, with C-suite. When we are mentioning board here, just want to say that it means not just supervisory board or C-suite. We are thinking also about the leaders like a middle management, senior management. And I work precisely on working on their culture and their practices. And today, as I mentioned to you, we have Dr. Wieke Skolton, and she is also working and engaging a lot with boards, with big companies, with global banks, regulators, and central banks, especially in the area of culture and board practices, in order to achieve positive outcome. And that's the way how she do it. It's through board effectiveness reviews and also behavioral risk reviews. And today we are going to explore what in board practices could unintentionally impair fulfillment of ESG responsibility, but we'll take that through understanding the behavioral perspective of board effectiveness. So when we work on understanding the G, the governance from ESG, we want to clarify the roles and responsibilities. We work usually to clarify the corporate code, the misconduct, the training of board directors. But most boards are really bought into the idea of ESG. They understand the relevance and the importance. But do we really look at how we do the things at the board level? Because there are some certain aspects in the way how the board work that may unintentionally hinder the fulfillment of the ESG strategy, but also fulfillment of the objective and strategy of the company. So in the board practice, usually how board communicate, what type of decisions, how they take the decisions, how they respond on shortcomings. These are all the things which make how the board works. And this sometimes we are feeling that it is really a blind spot. Because of that, we want today to discuss that blind spot with Vika on this fire chat and to increase the awareness of this blind spot. Because with understanding of that blind spot, we can help the board to achieve the strategy, whether it's ESG strategy or their main board and company strategy and objective. So, as I mentioned, that's the blind spot, Vika, and because of that, let's discuss about the aspects that how the board work. So my first question for you will be, what do we mean by board practices? And how behavioral science informs their effectiveness?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I think what is important to stress to start with is that when we talk about practices, and we brought a couple of slides so that you just, you can also look at the screen instead of at our beautiful green suits that we obviously called this morning each other what we should wear. When we talk about board practices, it's really taking a practical view of how we do things within the board. So there are aspects within a board, how we make decisions, how we communicate, how we collaborate, indeed how we respond to shortcomings,
yeah.
respond to mistakes, leadership behavior of the chair, for example, that can be typical of that board. Many senior leaders, and I'm sure there are a couple of you here in the room as well, who serve on different boards will understand exactly, I think, what we're talking about, that there's something typical to each group that's very explainable by behavioral science. And the great thing about behavioral science is that we know quite well what aspects of how we do things in a board drive better outcomes, and what aspects may unintentionally often, because this has nothing to do with intentions, which is, I think, an important point to make, what aspects can also drive poor outcomes. So this work of behavioral risk management at board level, which it actually is about understanding what aspects of how we typically do things within the board, which is our board practices, drive what we want to achieve and may unintentionally drive poor outcomes, so that we can address them now and prevent those poor outcomes by taking a behavioral lens to our board effectiveness.
Great, thank you. And then about the second part, we are talking always about patterns and drivers. What are some specific examples of behavioral patterns and drivers within the board which can unintentionally hinder a board's ability to fulfill the ESG strategy?
Yeah, and I think this is a fascinating question, right? Because when we engage with boards, we often notice that there's a lot of, like I said, good intention. Everybody wants to, let's say, weigh stakeholder interests in their decision making. So it's often also incorporated in our governance codes. It's sometimes also upheld by the law. And everybody wants to do that at board level. Board directors want to do a good job when it comes to ESG. But then you have practice, right? That's about reality. And when we engage with senior leadership teams on how to go from that good intention and that conceptual, let's say, truth that we all have to actually doing it in a bit of a different way, so changing those aspects that may unintentionally hinder us as a board to fulfill our ESG responsibilities, then you can look at a couple of behavioral categories and drivers, and maybe I can show that also on the slide. So let's see if this clicker works. Yeah, this is a model that we often work with when we work with senior leadership teams, where you can see at the top of this tree outcomes, which is can be poor outcomes, good outcomes, strategy fulfillment in your ESG responsibilities. And so that is where the outcome sits. Then the behaviors within the board are at trunk level. And we do that because behaviors is what you see and hear. This refers to those practices. It's what you can see and hear when you are in that board reality, in those board meetings, in the way we prepare board meetings, the way we make decisions. And it's always about patterns, so not one-offs, and it's about how we do it as a group, not about individual directors. So that's also important in this line of work, that it's not about individual behavior, it is about how we do things here. And then you have driver level, which is more underground, so it's harder to observe, but that is what drives how we do things in a group of people, whether that is actually a board or you can apply this to any team. So at behavioral level, there are 4 main categories from a social and organizational psychological perspective that we know most of what patterns in those categories relate to outcomes. Because the link between drivers, behaviors, outcomes is substantiated by behavioral science, right? We know that responding to shortcomings, if you respond as a leader to shortcomings with blame, that will lead to others, the tendency to cover up your mistakes, because we all want to avoid blame. So that is a universal sort of behavioral effect of responding to shortcomings with a blaming response. So that we know that may lead to drive, for example, certain conduct risks or other types of risks is substantiated by experimental research. Now, at driver level, so those 4 categories, decision-making, communication and collaboration, responding to shortcomings and leadership, I would always advise you to look at those board practices through that lens. So take that sort of perspective on when we talk about behavior, what are we talking about? At driver level, you can distinguish whatever is on paper that may drive behavior. And we do a lot of work in financial services.
Yes.
And where you see in financial services, there's this also belief that you can steer behavior with whatever you write on paper. So we call that organizational driver. So anything on paper that may drive behavior, like procedures, processes, codes, strategy. We clarify roles and responsibilities, and then we think, we make people accountable, we change our accountability structure, and then we think the behavior will change. And it's one of the drivers, so it does change behavior, but there's many more. So other driver categories are about what happens between people that drives behavior, social drivers, so that can be dynamics, conflicts, the way we deal with conflicts in the board, can be individual drivers, character. I was at a meeting the other day where people said, board directors, that's all about characters and personality and egos. Well, so much of our group behavior is driven by a wide range of drivers, not just personalities. And then you have contextual drivers as well, which is, I think, in the current environment that we do business in, yes, very relevant in terms of geopolitical developments, for example, that influence how we behave in a board. So this is the structure I would think in. And if may a last point on this, sorry that I'm taking such a long time, dear Tanya, is about examples of red flags. And I'm sure these are very logical for you perhaps to look at, but it's this type of, what do you then look for in these categories? So you see outcomes at the top, impaired fulfillment of ESG responsibilities, let's say. In decision making that you see a type of paralysis, because there's so much happening in the world that we just refrain from taking a decision right now. Or I already mentioned responding to shortcomings with, for example, a blaming response or with denial. At a driver level, it can be around not having or having a shared belief that we're already doing well on ESG. Yeah, or it's something else. It's something extra that we have to do instead of something that is part of how we do things in the board. So here you see some examples of red flags that we can come across when we do board effectiveness reviews and look at ESG. Yeah.
And something very interesting which I learned from Vika when we used to work together, and you mentioned about that, it's not about the individual, it's about how we do the things together, the group dynamic. And the phrase that you have, it's not about the apple, it's about the barrel. And that one of your books that you're explaining about that. So then I would like to ask you about strategies. What are the strategies for boards to enhance their ESG goals?
Well, it starts with knowing exactly what aspects, what are typical things of how we make decisions, how we communicate, how we collaborate within this board may unintentionally impair us fulfilling those ESG responsibilities. So understanding what those aspects are. And we find it, as people, I think, inherently difficult to look at those challenges because of those good intentions. Yeah. So when we meet with boards, it's often, but we have such good intentions, so why would we look at those aspects? But that is actually the first step to understand. Look back to a complex decision you were making as a board last year or as a senior leadership team. And in what decision was it particularly challenging, or when you reflect, didn't do the best job you wanted to do when it comes to your ESG goals and objectives? And what was it exactly that made that happen? So that understanding is first, and then is to address it. And we brought an example, I think, here. It always takes a mix of different interventions. So this is an example of a situation where a supervisory board said, we insufficiently weighed society's interest in certain decision-making processes. Whilst we are bound to and want to do that, we still didn't do that in certain situations. So they had 3 interventions ideas. One was, because you can never change this with one intervention. So that's also important in behavioral change, I think, to acknowledge. But you can do this very targetedly instead of talking about intention, making it very concrete. Do a workplace visit, for example, to a place that sort of increases the awareness around that society's interest. Create a decision tree or some type of procedure in your decision making to process to ensure you explicitly pay attention to this factor. And third was to review, to ensure that you do a board evaluation where you also incorporate a behavioral lens and perspective instead of just looking at the design of your governance, for example. Yeah.
Super, great. Thank you very much for that. And then I would like to share something also. It's about the benefits that we observed with this.
Yes, exactly. Because I wonder what your view is on benefits but also the challenges.
Yes.
When it comes to board effectiveness reviews.
Yes. So during conducting and working together on many projects about behavioral risk review and also board effectiveness review, speaking with a lot of leaders, which are chair of boards and also with shareholders, and the surveys that we have it for our work that we have done, the challenges that we faced with the behavioral risk review, first it was about the short-term focus, usually the geopolitical development and the immediate pressure that the board is having. Sometimes they want to prioritize the quick decisions instead of focusing or short-term decisions instead of focusing on long-term improvements. That's one challenge. Then the second challenge is resistance to change. Sometimes board members are really reluctant to accept the behavioral findings that we are having. And that sometimes the reason for that is that there is a pressure for the things which are changing in the environment, in their business, and they are reluctant for changes and for accepting the behavioral shortcomings. And then the third one, it is about time constraint. We are quite aware that the boards, the management, everyone is busy with a busy schedule, with a full diary of meetings, and sometimes they don't have really time to be involved in constructive discussions and also to reflect and to take back how they have done the things, which sometimes can really impact that they will be not having enough time to be involved in the behavioral review. But these are the challenges, and we are trying and working on the way how to overcome them. But then from the positive things, I would like also to stress 3 things, which 3 is lucky number here, everyone to remember. So the first one is the precise and effective development. Usually the focused behavioral reviews, they really improve the board practices. And the time which is really spent on these behavioral reviews leads to meaningful changes. Then the second is action-oriented approach, and Vika mentioned that. Let's turn the words into action. So instead of discussing about theoretical improvements, these behavioral reviews, they really drive actionable strategies, which are helping in improving the decision-making process, but also the resilience of board and also the resilience of the company. And the third one is the improved engagement. By identifying areas for growth, that's also helping to build a board which will be quite proactive and really engaged. And that's helping really in improving the collaboration and effectiveness of the board. So these are the things which I have observed working in the time with Vika. But I will leave, Vika, now to you just to give the conclusion, because this morning we had a nice discussion about different soap, about the spices, and I will leave to you to give that example, please.
Thank you. Yeah, no, indeed, we were talking about how to use a metaphor in our closing statements.
Yeah.
To help sort of land the message that this is not something extra. Sometimes people, when we work indeed with boards who say we already have such a full agenda, and now we have to do something separate to also look at our behavior, whatever that is. So if you look at board practices, you're actually just refining how you do things already. So it's like making a meal. We said, you know, what if you're in the kitchen and you cook a meal? You have to cook the meal anyway. But instead of using these spices, you now use other spices. That's actually to get a better outcome, a better tasting meal. So you integrate it in what you already do. So it's not something like a training on culture that you have to go to for 2 days, and then there's reality again. So it's in your reality, and it's, I think, really proven effective to add a behavioral lens and use social and organizational psychology to improve effectiveness of your board and the outcomes you're reaching. So, perfect, thank you.
Thank you very much, and pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, likewise.